Yo, Joe! We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero.
That's right, G.I. Joe, a real American hero, America's movable fighting man. But I'm not talking about these guys just yet. Am I going back 40 years for something just as metal? Like, say, this guy? No, I'm going back even further. All the way back to June 17th, 1942, where our story of G.I. Joe begins. Sergeant Dave Brieger and I share a birthday of April 15th, where he was born a few years earlier, back in 1908, and grew up to be a cartoonist, creating the character of G.I. Joe in the first issue of Yank, the Army Weekly. A rebranding of his earlier self-referential Private Brieger comic strip from the pages of the Saturday Evening Post, G.I. General Issue Joe Trooper was a humorous look at life in the United States Army during World War II. Yank, the Army Weekly, was the most widely read magazine in the history of the United States military. Before long, the comic feature had become so widely known and world famous that the name G.I. Joe became the de facto term for the American foot soldier, the Army's everyman. Cartoonist Dave Brieger climbed the ranks from corporal to sergeant and eventually lieutenant while contributing G.I. Joe to Yank magazine. When the war was over, the magazine and the comic ended, and while the original character was forgotten, the name lived on. The first use we see of that name by another source was while his adventures in Yank were still in print. The Unique Art Manufacturing Company, under license from the G.I. Joe Corporation, created this lithographed tin wind-up toy called G.I. Joe in His Jouncing Jeep in April of 1944. This was the very first G.I. Joe toy. In fact, it was a line of toys. A small line, though, because there was only one other edition by way of another tin wind-up toy called G.I. Joe and His Canine Pups. Three years and a day after his debut in the pages of Yank, the famous name saw its big screen release with the film The Story of G.I. Joe on June 18, 1945. A tribute to the American infantrymen during World War II, the story is pulled from the columns of and told through the eyes of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and one of America's best-known war correspondents, Ernie Pyle. The film, starring Burgess Meredith and Robert Mitchum, would be nominated for 4 Academy Awards.
That is our war, and we will carry it with us as we go from one battleground to another until it's all over.
G.I. Joe would not resurface again for 5 years until comic book publisher Ziff Davis started a 51-issue run of G.I. Joe comics from 1950 to 1957, wherein he was a soldier in the Korean War named G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe, on the land, on the sea, in the air.
Here he is, Hasbro's 1964 G.I. Joe, the world's first action figure. But his origins don't entirely lie with his G.I. Joe predecessors. Instead, we need to travel to Germany, back in time to June 24th, 1952, where a comic strip character named Lily debuted in the Hamburg newspaper Bild Zeitung. An irreverent, high-end call girl of sorts that became so popular, she was made into an adult novelty doll in 1955 and initially sold in tobacco shops and bars as a gag gift for men. But soon the toy became so popular with children that toy factories began manufacturing dollhouses, clothes, and accessories to scale with Lily, and she spread to other European countries. And that's when Lily caught the eye of the 15-year-old daughter of Ruth Handler, co-founder of the Mattel Toy Company, in 1956 while on vacation in Switzerland. Handler brought the doll back home to California, slightly reworked her design, renamed her after her daughter, and released the first Barbie doll on March 9th, 1959. Ruth Handler's son was the namesake for Barbie's boyfriend Ken, but it was her husband and co-founder of Mattel Toys, Elliot Handler's friendship with licensing entrepreneur Stan Weston that was the impetus for the creation of the G.I. Joe action figure. You see, Weston had noticed how popular the Barbie doll was with girls and felt that an action soldier with military uniforms, weaponry, and vehicles would have a similar effect on boys. It was during a meeting with Hasbro's head of research and development, Don Levine, that Weston proposed his soldier doll concept. Levine then used an artist's mannequin as inspiration for size, articulation, and posability. And to avoid competition, he insisted on covering all branches of the military from the start: Army, Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. Staff artist Janet Downing thought it wise to never think of or refer to these as dolls and chose the name G.I. Joe, which was now well known from the famous movie. And so, on February 2nd, 1964, the first boys action figure, G.I. Joe, America's movable fighting man, was born.
G.I. Joe, U.S. Army, reporting for duty.
The toy line was an instant juggernaut success. And this documentary covers his story in tremendous detail. In the same year of G.I. Joe's debut in 1964, the toy company Marx rushed to market Stony Smith as competition. But next to Joe, he was just a hunk of plastic. They fared better the following year by going in a different direction and morphing Stony into Johnny West, and continued on with a successful line of Best of the West toys. That takes us to 1966, when Stan Weston enters the story again with his latest creation, Captain Action, at the Ideal Toy Corporation. This was an action figure similar to G.I. Joe and made for direct competition to him, but instead of dressing as a soldier, he would dress as various licensed characters such as Superman, Flash Gordon, Captain America, and the Lone Ranger. The following year he would get an enemy, the villainous Dr. Evil. Captain Action even had his own comic series. And in that year of 1967, G.I. Joe was released by Takara in Japan as Combat Joe, and takes with him the idea of comic character costumes from Captain Action, but uses Japanese characters instead, such as Gogeta. In 1972, Combat Joe becomes clear with metallic innards and is renamed Henshin Cyborg. Henshin for transforming because of the costume changes, Cyborg because of his new robotic look. In 1974, Henshin Cyborg shrinks from 12 inches to 8 inches as Shonen Cyborg, and to 3 3/4 inches to become Micro Man. And in 1977, Micro Man would make his way to America to be released by the Mego Corporation as the Micronauts. Then in 1982, G.I. Joe shrinks down to Micro Man's size. We won't explore that yet, because back in Japan, Micro Man had been evolving each year until 1983, when he had become a series of robots that would transform into vehicles and everyday objects in two subgroup lines called Micro Change and Diaclone. The following year, in 1984, Hasbro, maker of G.I. Joe, would release the Micro Change and Diaclone lines in America as the Transformers. So G.I. Joe bounced back and forth from the United States to Japan for 20 years, until he became a Transformer. Not only were both toy lines produced by Hasbro, but they both had comic books from Marvel and cartoon series from Sunbow Animation featuring the same voice cast, and at times the characters would cross over into each other's comics and cartoons. They were truly cousins.
Stranger things have happened.
But let's go back to see where we left G.I. Joe hanging at the end of the 60s. While his cousin was overseas becoming a small transforming robot, Joe was beginning to falter here in the States due to resentment over the Vietnam War. So Hasbro changed gears, took G.I. Joe out of the military, and in 1970 made him a man of action. He was no longer a member of the armed services, he was a member of the adventure team. Over land, sea, and air, he would go on the white tiger hunt, capture the pygmy gorilla, and learn the secret of the mummy's tomb. He was an expert in karate, a secret agent, and a survivalist in search of the abominable snowman. Hasbro's UK licensee, Palitoy, had been marketing G.I. Joe in Europe as Action Man since 1966, but in 1970 created a new innovation. They added realistic hair with a flocking method, moved away from just repackaging Joe and started developing his products with a British theme. The story of Action Man can be learned about in this documentary. Back in the States, Hasbro would add the flocked hair and beards to the G.I. Joe Adventure Team in 1971, Kung Fu Grip in 74, a lifelike body in 75, and a talking mechanism with movable eagle eyes in 76. New characters were also added to the line in 76 by the way of Mike Power, the Atomic Man, and Bullet Man. Mike Power was a knockoff of the $6 Million Man from Kenner Toys. Bullet Man was a modern interpretation of an obscure and forgotten comic book character. G.I. Joe also got his first enemy, by way of the Intruders, tiny cavemen who were supposedly super strong, highly intelligent aliens. Back at Mattel, maker of the Barbie doll, to compete with Joe for the marketplace, they released Big Jim in 1971. He had a successful line of interesting toys, and his tiger would be re-released in the Masters of the Universe line as He-Man's Battle Cat. And over at the Mego Corporation, home of the Micronauts, they released Action Jackson, also in 1971. The main difference being the size. Unlike Joe's 12 inches, Jackson was only 8. He didn't sell well, so by the next year they changed him into a new line of figures called the World's Greatest Superheroes, and would be very successful with it for the rest of the decade. So well, in fact, that plummeting sales of G.I. Joe, coupled with the rising cost of manufacturing a 12-inch plastic toy, spelled the end of the Adventure Team by 1976. And that's when something big happened. 1977 saw the release of Star Wars. Children wanted toys. The Ideal Toy Company, maker of Captain Action, G.I. Joe creator Stan Weston's other action figure, released a line of Star Team toys like the Knight of Darkness to cash in on the hunger for space-themed toys. G.I. Joe tried something new. In 1977, they released Super Joe. Same size and superhero sentiment as the figures from Mego, with a series of space-themed enemies. It didn't work, and G.I. Joe was no more. By 1978, Star Wars toys from Kenner began to flood the marketplace. Kenner was the company that gave us the Easy Bake Oven in 1963, Spirograph in 66, $6 Million Man in 75, and Stretch Armstrong in 1976. Now they were changing the face of the toy industry with Microman scaled figures, though they were actually influenced by the Fisher-Price line of Adventure People figures, due to their small size, limited articulation, and array of vehicles and playsets. Companies had to change up their output to match the consumer's thirst for robots, aliens, and space toys. Mego released the Micronauts, as well as a hodgepodge of other Japanese toys under the banner Shogun Warriors. Even Action Man over in the UK, which was still continuing unabated, got a Space Robot edition when parent company Palitoy licensed Parker Brothers' Rom the Space Knight in 1979 as Action Man's enemy. So, as the decade came to a close, G.I. Joe no longer existed in any medium. What did his future hold? Well, his biggest success was yet to come.
Yo, Joe! He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force.
It's here, the G.I. Joe collection. G.I. Joe from Hasbro.
Yes! G.I. Joe! It was the summer of 1982. I was 8 years old, I saw a brand new toy, and I became obsessed. This would become the first thing that I would make a point to collect, and I had to have them all. Weaponry, heavy equipment, jungle warfare, and lots of green. I loved it! But it's hard to say why. I had no connection to the military. I had no idea what war was really like. I didn't even know anyone who had ever been a soldier. In fact, to this day, I've never actually fired a weapon of any kind. I just knew that I could relate to a man in the army fighting a terrorist organization more than I could a Jedi Knight flying through space. And I wanted in on all that fantasy adventure. G.I. Joe had been out of production since 1978, but starting the following year, Hasbro's Vice President of Boys Toys, Bob Prupis, put forth a project concept of Star Wars toy-scale soldiers and vehicles under the codename Operation Blastoff. But the time wasn't right, and the project was shelved. The idea was not revived again until the following year, when during a meeting in 1980, in-house concept artist Ron Rudat presented his design for the new Tough Truck to project manager Kirk Bazigian. He had taken a Tough Truck, painted it olive green, and applied a new G.I. Joe logo. A fire was set. The burn for G.I. Joe began to live again. But the problem was the competition. Star Wars had the most successful toy line at the time and another film heading to theaters. G.I. Joe had nothing. It would take another year to formulate a game plan, and that's when, in 1981, Kirk Bazigian suggested that Marvel Comics could create identities for the G.I. Joe characters, storylines to read, and animated commercials could advertise the comics on TV. Over at Marvel, the line of Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos comics were coming to an end, and artist-writer Larry Hama was creating a concept for a new comic about a team led by Nick Fury's son called Fury Force. The concept wasn't picked up, but it perfectly coincided with the relaunch of G.I. Joe. Larry was tapped to create the Joe character biographies and write the comics, and he incorporated his ideas from Fury Force. Kirk Bazigian would take Hama's character biographies and edit them into file cards to be included on the packaging of each of the toys. And an enemy for G.I. Joe was created, Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world. Star Wars action figures had 5 points of articulation, but G.I. Joe would double that with 10. The new G.I. Joe toys and comics were released in the summer of 1982, and that's when I entered the picture. The initial run of figures were mostly green, and one was completely black. Though interesting, I wanted one that stood out. 2 of the figures had orange pads on their chest, but only one of those came with the large, heavy artillery laser, so he was my first. Grand Slam. The first year of the G.I. Joe relaunch was so successful that new points of articulation were added in 1983 called Swivel Arm Battle Grip. I would actively collect every G.I. Joe toy that I could find for 5 years, amassing almost everything there was, as well as watching the cartoon and reading the comics. The last figure that I would get was Gung Ho in his dress blues on my first trip to a Toys R Us in 1987. But by then I was a teenager, about to enter high school, and I left toy collecting behind. I would return to G.I. Joe 20 years later, when in 2007, for the line's 25th anniversary, modern, updated recreations of the toys started to hit store shelves. I've been collecting those for 10 years now, recreating the line of toys from the 80s, including many incarnations never originally made. I've attended G.I. Joe conventions and met many of the creative people that were involved in the line. Here is Larry Hama drawing Grand Slam and the Hal for me. My favorite toy of the original line was the Bridge Layer, driven by Toll Booth. Here is the modern version of Toll Booth. Here's my original Herb Trimpe artwork for Toll Booth's entry in the Order of Battle comic book. Here is my copy of that comic, signed. And here are my original Russ Heath painted cell model sheets for Toll Booth and the Bridge Layer for the G.I. Joe animated series. The designs for almost all of the G.I. Joe action figures were created by Ron Rudat, most vehicle designs handled by Greg Bernston, and almost every issue of the comic series written and artistically laid out by Larry Hama. And you can learn all about the history of how G.I. Joe was relaunched in the 80s by watching this terrific documentary. Now let me show you my collection. But that's not all. When G.I. Joe was relaunched, it had competition. 1982 also saw the release of military figures from the Mego Corporation called Eagle Force. These were half the size of Joe, made of die-cast metal, and included the first ever ninja action figure, Savitar. Over in the UK, Palitoy shrunk their British Joe counterpart Action Man down to Action Force. Originally a distinct line of figures with only 5 points of articulation, they would become repaints of G.I. Joe figures by 1983. Mego, on the other hand, went out of business. And then there's this guy. Released by a company called Gay Toys, he wasn't a part of Eagle Force or Action Force. He was in Laser Force, and his vehicle line was a part of many collections. You can see that his tank has the same 788 designation as the Cobra Hiss. After I grew out of the original line, it would continue on without me. There was another animated series from 1989 to 1992, but the toy line and the comic series would both end in 1994. Since then, it has come back in many forms, and this year, 2017, marks 75 years since his debut in Yank magazine. And now you know!
And knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
This month is the 10th anniversary of the modern line of G.I. Joe toys that rekindled my collecting. And over the weekend, I went to JoeCon, the official G.I. Joe convention. It was my second JoeCon, but my 50th convention overall. At JoeCon, we had a surprise guest with Ron Rudat, designer of almost every G.I. Joe action figure I had as a child. An appearance so rare, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And through certain channels, I knew he was going to be there, so I commissioned him to draw me a picture of Toll Booth, driver of the bridge layer. His son Tristan took our photo. I wish I got a picture with him as well because we've known each other online for a few years, but this was our first chance getting to meet and talk face to face. Speaking of which, Mr. Rudat revealed during the designers panel that he had started at Hasbro in 1971 doing work on the Weebles. And he designed one of the Weebles after his son Tristan. Now, since Mr. Rudat used his own likeness for the character of Leatherneck, I had hoped if I could meet him one day that I could get him to sign Leatherneck's action figure file card for me. So I got one years ago, and I even met the voice actor, Chuck McCann, who did the voice of Leatherneck in the animated series, and I got him to sign the file card. And I've been holding on to it for years, and now this was finally my chance to get Mr. Rudat to sign it as well. And I forgot it at home. But I bought another file card while I was at JoeCon, and I got Mr. Rudat to sign that one. So, there we go. Mr. Rudat left the G.I. Joe design team just prior to the final wave of figures that I collected as a child, right before the animated movie came out. And he was replaced by artist Mark Pennington. Here's the book of G.I. Joe action figure designs that I got from him. And he even made a sketch for me on the back page. The last character that Mr. Rudat began design work on and had that design completed by Mr. Pennington was Crocmaster. And I got a print of those design sketches signed by both men. I got that Crocmaster print from Dan Klingensmith, who's been putting together these amazing books of all that G.I. Joe concept artwork. Like Crocmaster. And he gave me an extra box so that I could get it signed by designer Greg Burnson. Mr. Burnson designed my favorite G.I. Joe vehicle, the bridge layer. This was the fourth time that I got to see Larry Hama, and I used this opportunity to get him to draw me Toll Booth as well. So what's the deal with all this Toll Booth bridge layer stuff, you ask? You must not have seen my crossover episode with Hooded Cobra Commander 788. Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Maley, and I host a web series called Venture into the Vault. G.I. Joe was the first property that I actively pursued collecting everything in the entire run. From my straight-armed Grand Slam in 1982 to my dress uniform gung-ho in 1987. I amassed an almost complete collection up to the release of the animated movie, and I had one favorite toy of the line, a 1985 bridge layer, and its driver, Toll Booth. Now when I was a kid, my house was surrounded by the woods, so I would find a little alcove with one way in, one way out, and I would dig a trench right across the opening. Now with my trench dug, I could put the G.I. Joe base inside the alcove, and then when it was time to go out and hunt down Cobra, the bridge layer would lead the charge. Laid the bridge across. Then let everyone pass. Retrieve the bridge, follow the troops, and the base is secure. After a 2-decade bridge of time since I stopped collecting, Hasbro began releasing updated versions of the original line for the 25th anniversary of G.I. Joe, Real American Hero in 2007. And I began collecting again. Over these last 10 years, I've obtained a new version of almost every figure I used to own, and almost just as many that I never had. Now, they haven't given us a new bridge layer, but in 2013, they gave us a new toll booth. Though nothing beats the originals when it comes to nostalgia, there are many new improvements to enjoy. The thumbs and crotches don't break off so easily anymore. The sculpting, paint applications, articulation, and accessories have all been improved on. They've slightly reorganized things on his new file card and included that after MIT and before G.I. Joe, he joined the U.S. Army and graduated at the top of his class of the Sapper Leader course at the Combat Engineer School at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. The Sapper Leader course refers to a 28-day course designed to train joint service leaders in small unit tactics, leadership skills, and tactics required to perform as part of a combined arms team. They've also removed Stalker's quote to include, "Tollbooth performs a variety of combat engineering duties, such as laying or clearing minefields and building bridges. He is proficient in demolitions, field defenses, and general construction, as well as road and airfield fabrication and repair." Sadly, G.I. Joe is a lot harder and more expensive to collect than it was in the 80s. For the most part, you're not going to find these in stores anymore. And Toll Booth here is only available through a subscription service to the G.I. Joe Collectors Club. His body construction is made up of parts from 5 different previously released figures, but cast and painted to match the 1985 original, while his head is a completely new sculpt. It comes with these 2 safety cones, barbed wire, a pistol, his display stand, another pistol in a holster, his mallet, a pickaxe, and this vest web gear that you can take off. His head moves side to side and down. His torso can twist all the way around. His arms can spin completely around that way and this way. His elbow articulation, wrist articulation, his legs, double jointed knees, and you can spin his ankles. Toll booth. I've been fortunate enough to obtain the original model sheet animation cells for the bridge layer and toll booth, as well as the original Herb Trimpe artwork for Toll Booth's inclusion in the Order of Battle comic series, and a copy of that comic signed by everyone involved. I've also commissioned Toll Booth artwork from Ron Rudat and Larry Hama, which I'll be featuring in an updated segment on my own series. In the meantime, I've got Toll Booth artwork from Hooded Cobra Commander. And here's my own artwork for all of us involved in this episode. And guess who I ran into at the convention? The Commander himself, with his whole family, who we've all gotten to see on his very exciting series, HCC 788. And thanks to him asking me to collaborate on that Bridge Layer episode, I got a much wider audience, and a lot of people even recognized me at the convention from it. And I recognized Christopher McLeod from the Full Force podcast. It was such a surreal experience to hear that very recognizable British voice coming out of a real-life human being. I was getting the chance to meet so many people that I've been following online for years. And that brings me to Robert Carson Metaxas from 3djoes.com. I've got all of the posters that he's created framed on my walls. I've got every volume of Collecting the Art of G.I. Joe that he's made. And when he showed me that the latest printing of Volume 2 has new artwork in it, I had to get a new copy of that as well. Well, we had a great conversation. I wish I got a picture with him. Speaking of collecting books, I've been getting every one of these from noted author James Cavanaugh, including Rank and File Volume 3, which had its pre-release debut at the convention. One of the vendors I got a chance to talk to was David Lee from Castaway Toys, who happens to have acquired the license to Action Jackson. You remember, Nego's very first 8-inch action figure? Here's my original from 1971, who I got the version that most closely matches the box art. Well, there were two other versions, one of which was an African-American version that literally jumped off the shelf while I was there and landed on me. So I had to bring him home, and he's made with this much better designed new body. And I got him a knife as well. Now there was a third version, one with facial hair. And Castaway Toys made this version of him as if he were a toy line compatible with the original 1982 G.I. Joe line. I also picked up this convention-exclusive Bombardier action figure from Joe Declassified, which is a recreation of the unreleased Action Force figure that has a very interesting story that you can read about on the Blood for the Baron website. He'll look great right next to my modern version of him. I met a lot of great people, had awesome conversations, saw so many amazing things, and bought a lot too, including this competitor for G.I. Joe in 1982, Sergeant Rock, this ultra-tiny version of G.I. Joe, and even this microscopic version. Hasbro no longer does anything with the G.I. Joe property. So it's the guys and girls in our community, the people that I got to see at the convention, that are the only reason why G.I. Joe is still alive. And I'm glad that I had a chance to go see them. This is Raptor from G.I. Joe from 1987. He's actually a member of the bad guys, Cobra. He's their accountant. Raptor from 2017. 30 years later. Raptor! Raptor. Raptor. Well, let's take a look at him. I know it's cold, but I wanted to bring you in here. This is the lowest level of the archive, and where I keep my oldest possessions. Let me show you something. This was my first toy, the 1973 Fisher-Price Activity Center. This was hanging in my crib, and when I was born in 1974, I had something to play with. My first action figure. A Sesame Street Ernie stacking toy.